Now we enter into our budget study session. Did you want to lead that off, Madam
I'd be happy
City?
to. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tonight is our first of two study sessions on the budget for fiscal year 14-15, and so Jeremy's going to call up the budget presentation. You've seen this slide before. Cloudy, but sun shining through. We're going to show a few slides that you've seen before, but the focus is to hear about revenue and projections, which Jeremy and I are going to do first, and then after that we have a series of presentations. Next slide. You're going to hear tonight, after we're done, a presentation from Police, Fire, Public Works, Utilities, Human Resources, and Finance and Information Technology. Our focus of our budget presentations is to briefly talk about what we do and then just highlight major changes. For the most part, this is a status quo budget, and so it's not proposing a lot of changes, but there are some, and those are done to address specific projects or issues that have been identified, direction from the council, that kind of thing. So next slide.
I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
From Council Member Hunt.
Yeah, it's before we get started, and I know I don't want to take a lot of time, but I did want to ask a couple questions about the instruments that you gave us.
Yes, sir.
Because I do have some questions before we go into these, because I spent the weekend poring over these instruments, and they're a lot of fun, I must say. But on the one thing I wanted to comment on is the operating budget and capital improvement. There's some pretty severe formatting issues that I'd like to see cleaned up. They're in the first 6 pages, and the document's name is called Draft Operating Budget and Capital Improvement Projects. And I think it had to do with the PDF transfer and stuff, but you know, it's the kind of thing where my name is on it. And your name's on it too, and I don't want years back when somebody takes a look at those first 3 pages. It's page 3, 4, and 5, and you can look at the formatting on there. And I hope we can just change that when we get the final one done before we put it in.
We are going to work very hard to fix that problem because it is a translation issue between the original document to the PDF, and we have 3 different computer programs that come together to make this document. So we are definitely going to work on that.
You definitely get it together on page 7. There's no more after page 7. It's just those first 3 pages, and it's a pretty severe
Appreciate you pointing that out.
Formatting problem. The other question I have is on this document, this binder that you gave us, expenditure amount budgets, and what you provided us was a run for 2014-2015, and all of the amounts in there are just listed amounts. I think what would be more beneficial for me in doing the analysis would be a run from the 2013-2014, and then I could look at the percentage of the lapsed year and compare it to the current expenses. So like if somebody, it's 75% into the season, or 75% of the fiscal budget, if we've only spent 20% of the money, I'd go, well, is there a reason for that? Is all the money coming? But when you just list this, I would rather have a run of last year so I could see whether those areas that are of interest. And like if, for example, if it's 75% of the budget, we're at 75% of the fiscal year, and we spend 180% of the budget, I might have a question about that. I don't really have a question when it just shows 0, 0, 0 across. So, and maybe you can explain that to me.
Okay. Well, when you see the budget document, which is this one, which is the operating budget and capital improvement plan document, that document just shows a roll-up and a very generic description of the expenditures by type in each department. And we've been asked for the detail of what goes into each of those accounts. Let me give you an example. I'll pick on the police department just because I happened to land there first. You have one on page 77 of the operating budget. You have a 1-page general description roll-up of how the money was spent in 11-12, an actual for 12-13, and then the adjusted budget that we're projecting at the close of 13-14, and then the proposed budget for 14-15. What this binder includes are all of the line items that are proposed in the roll-up. So you'll be able to go into salaries and benefits, and you'll see a breakdown of how that's used by the various account codes in the department. You'll be able to look in services and supplies and see the detail of what they're proposing to spend the money on. So this is basically giving you basically a line item detail of how we're proposing to spend the money in 14-15. And that was a specific request we had.
I think that's a good idea, and it sort of, I guess it gets to this zero-based budgeting kind of a concept, as opposed to a ECB budget, which is, you know, I get that. But what I would like is that, given your example, you used, I don't want to pick on the police department, but you talked about, you know, $1.2 million in salaries that are going to be projected. What I would like to see is we're 75% into the fiscal year this year, and they've not spent 1.2, so I could ask questions about those anomalies in the budget. If we're going to go to a zero-based budgeting, I think it's important for us to be able to analyze why would it be that if we budgeted, say, $70,000 and we're 75% into the budget and we haven't spent any. I would like to be able to find that and ask a question about that.
Yeah, we've never provided that level of detail before, but we can easily print up those. And then you get a similar binder to this, and it would be actually much thicker because you're going to see all this. Right now you just have the account code for the general item, and then the listing of the line items that go into that general account. Then you're going to, oh boy, this binder could be this thick.
Well, maybe I don't need that. I guess I'm asking what the value of this is, because if I were to see this and it's all projected, it doesn't give me a lot of information other than just a bunch of numbers. What would give me information is, again, assessing the current fiscal year, which if we're 75%, and the current spending and encumbrance. So then I could say, we haven't spent any of this money, why is it in there? Or we've spent more, maybe we've spent more than we have and we need to transfer money into that. So that's my interest, and maybe I can't get that, and that's okay.
No, I'm not saying that you can get anything you want. You're a council member. We work for you.
No.
But I think, you know, generally from a budgeting standpoint, this council's never done a line item review or a zero-based budget. Actually, every time we do this, the biggest question I get is how can we speed this process up, not slow it down. However, if the council wants to see where we're at as of, I think we can get reports through the end of March, April, okay, and we could maybe take a department as an example, and we'll put city manager's office out there, and you can see the type of detail that you'll get. If you want to see the expenditure, we could probably do it by general account instead of every actual individual expenditure. And we could probably print, let me talk to Connie and we'll see what we can do. You can see, you want to see a status quo of where we're at today and how we've spent it.
Yeah, again, I think for us to do an evaluation, it would be good to know what we spent and what the percentage is, and then we would be able to advise. Maybe we need more money in some other areas. Maybe we need, you know, we're never going to hit this. And I question the value of this. I mean, I guess.
In this document just is going to let you know under services and supplies in the office of the chief, not in patrol, how much they're spending on cell phones, how much they're spending on cleaning services, how much they're spending on mail. I mean, it breaks it down into more detail to tell you how we got to the total.
Maybe you can just give me the basics and we'll talk. Okay. We meet on Mondays.
Okay. I'll print up a sample and show that to you, sir, and we can go through it.
All right, move on. Okay. I don't want to slow the process down. Too late.
Yeah. Really.
On the forecast, we discussed this at your last meeting. We've made some adjustments to the forecast. I'll just run through these very quickly. Mentioned a $3.8 million clawback from the state of California due to redevelopment. That had a big impact on the bottom line for our general fund reserve going forward. We've changed the forecast to include current terms of MOUs. This year, probably the largest change in staffing has to do with Fire Station 75 coming online in September of 2015, and we need to hire on in April. So there's a quarter of funding for new staff to address the needs at that station. We have a new element just for this year. It's not projected forward, and I'll explain why in a minute. But we're proposing to spend $1.7 million on a capital improvement program for the general fund and purchasing of vehicles and equipment. And then, as we mentioned before at the last council meeting, we are projecting right now that we will be able to meet the first or lowest trigger of a quarter return of concessions based on the formula that we set, and that is revenues improving greater than projecting and taking out the fixed costs that we don't control, like pensions and health care. That, of course, will depend on the final closeout of the budget, which should be right around September, October of this year. Next slide. Here's the forecast slide that actually includes the added year of 18-19 on it. And the bottom line is where I spend most of my time focusing, but you will see a few things here. As you know, our projected reserve for the end of 13-14 looked very good. You can see at the bottom at 23.7%. A lot of people were saying, hey, if we're doing that great, we need to make some changes. And then it drops down to 16.3% at the end of 14-15, pretty dramatic drop. And what's interesting is the largest drop in that has to do with the clawback, but if you move back up on the page and you look at operating revenues, which is the first line, and operating expenses, which is the second line, your net operating is revenues minus expenses, and you always hope to be on the plus side, which means the number would not be in a parentheses. But basically, our revenues are still not keeping pace with our expenditures, which is what we talked about at the last council meeting. And when we add back in the Measure M revenue, which is about 2/3 of the way down the page, that Measure M revenue is what is keeping us in the black, so to speak, and that we are using those Measure M revenues to make up the difference between our operating expenses and our operating revenues. And the reason why I added projected 18-19 at the end of this chart is to show you, there's no number there for Measure M revenue. And look at our reserve, it drops to 3.5%. So we discussed at our last meeting the need to be looking farther ahead into the future. And, you know, all these projections can change a lot. We're talking about the economy improving and new businesses opening and new jobs. We have the potential for a large number of housing units to be built, which also generates new property taxes and new revenues for the city, and those things are not captured in here yet. So we need to see the effects of those things, but this is, you know, based on what we know today and everything being static, where we could be unless we make some change. So next slide. This is just a bar chart depiction of our bottom line in terms of the reserve, and in essence, I'm just basically saying we need to be watching out for what happens in 18-19 when Measure M goes away, and I'm already starting to work on that and actually have been for some time trying to come up with what are the best ways to deal with it. I don't want to belabor the point in saying that, you know, this is something we have to immediately react to. I think it's something that we need to plan for and start actually having a proactive program for what we do when Measure M retires. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy. He's going to dive deeper into the issue of what are our revenues and how are we projecting them in the budget, because everybody's to say, well, it's all on how you project it. These numbers can change, and so we want to show the council how we're doing that so that you're comfortable with the forecast. So, Jeremy.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. We want to take just a brief moment to walk you through some of the revenue basics. As you can see, for the general fund, the overwhelming amount of revenue is coming from some form of tax at $60.59 million. Fees and charges for services are also the next largest portion at $7.66 million. Take a closer look at taxes. You can see sales and property tax. By far, they make up nearly 3/4 of all the revenue for the general fund. So that's an area we track very closely. We work on throughout the year and following those revenue trends. For property taxes, we're beginning to see signs of general recovery in the property tax. We have a lot of appeals still outstanding that we're watching closely. Currently, a lack of new housing stock is limiting assessed value growth. We've been somewhat low the last 4 years in new housing starts. Our greatest potential for property tax growth is in that new development area. Until the overall property market begins to move, the assessed values that have been lowered by the assessor related to Prop 8, which is the rollback due to market conditions, really aren't going to change until houses start moving on a more frequent basis. Our forecast has included a 2% growth rate. That's consistent with Prop 13 inflation cap. We've chosen that at the direction of council that because this is an item that tends to lag in and lag out of a downturn, we think there's potential for growth out on the horizon, but we haven't seen it in the last few years, and we're projecting a conservative number and waiting for those numbers to materialize. So if we look at the history, as you can see, property tax had been streaming along at a pretty consistent pace before we hit the downturn in 07, 08. We continued that downward trend all the way through 12, 13. And 13, 14 is the first year we began to see an uptick. So we are seeing some positive signs that the property tax is beginning to move forward. As I mentioned, we're being conservative in our approach for forecasting, and we're hoping that the actual will beat our projection. But our history has been such over the last 5 years that we're reticent to try to do anything further. We think 2% is a good conservative number to ensure we don't overcommit ourselves. Sales tax revenues have recovered from the downturn. We saw less than 2% growth trending for the last year. But we are seeing some new businesses opening. We've seen some natural turnover in businesses. And we're still working on understanding how outlet mall competition is going to impact us in the long term. The new Livermore facility, Elk Grove's recently announced the development of a center. We think that will lead to some level of reduced sales tax volume. We're just not certain what that will be. We need Livermore to be up and running a little longer so we can do some of those comparisons. But we think it may have an impact on some of our key stores at the outlets. We're assuming 2.7 increase for 14-15. That is a consensus forecast from our consultant HDL, who does our sales tax review. That has a lot to do with continued strong sales in autos, gas tax staying somewhat stable over the term without any major increases. But we think it's a fairly conservative number. Hopefully, again, we'll beat those estimates. As you can see from our history, we've seen a pretty strong recovery over the past 5 years. Trending upward pretty heavily from 9-10 to 12-13 as we recovered, and seeing that kind of consistent growth in 13-14. HUTA revenue, I put the slide in just because I like to say HUTA whenever I can. It's a fun word. This is the highway user tax. We wanted to highlight this for you because, as you recall, during the downturn, we began diverting some of the highway user tax into the general fund to help offset maintenance operations in streets. That program was at $750,000 to $850,000. At council's direction last year, that was reduced to $350,000, and this year's budget takes that number to zero. We did want to note that one of the highway user tax, section 2107, has been set aside to fund our street lighting programs, and so it doesn't make its way into actual street maintenance. But the rest of those numbers have been freed up now purely to the streets. Brief history of the highway user tax revenue. In 11, 12, 12, 13, the legislature made some changes in how highway user tax was allocated to the cities. Because of that, this number adjusts every year. They adjust the amount of sales tax charged on gas tax in relation to the excise tax. So every year this number is going to fluctuate. We're just learning kind of how that impact is going to occur. The impact was in 13-14, it actually rose more than we anticipated. But the 14-15 projections have gone down quite a bit as the state has begun redoing those calculations. I apologize for the busyness of this slide, but one of the items that has been requested by the council and we've discussed in a few different updates was the impact Measure M is having on our overall fiscal health. So if you just follow along with me here, the black line you see is the actual Measure M revenues forecasted and accumulated over the term. So this in essence captures the 5-year history of Measure M. So you can see it gets just under $21 million. The blue line is the fund reserve represented by non-Measure M revenue. So this would represent, had we take Measure M out of the picture, here's what our fund reserve would begin to look like, assuming everything stayed the same. The red line is the actual forecasted fund reserve. So you can see the impact of Measure M has been to basically keep us afloat, maintain kind of a strong forecasted general fund reserve across most of the 5-year, but you can also see the impact of that fifth and final year when Measure M goes away, that those downtrends come back to bite pretty quickly. That's a pretty precipitous drop as that $4 million plus number disappears.
Okay, back to me. We have some other general fund revenues that we track in the budget, and our intergovernmental revenues assume about a 2% growth. Department fees and charges, small decrease, and a 2% growth thereafter. I think we're trying to be conservative here. These are not significant components to the budget, but we felt that with the economy still kind of lagging along, we want to project conservatively. And then finally, for all other revenues, we're assuming about a 2% increase. So it's a pretty flat, not overly rosy revenue projection overall. So I think the highest rate of growth was on sales tax at 2.7% overall, and that was based on HDL's recommendation, who's been tracking our sales taxes for many years. Next slide. So how do we spend our money? And as you can see, the biggest piece of our pie goes towards salary and benefits at about 70%. Our indirect costs at 12%, services and supplies 11%, overtime 2%. And we added a new slice to the pie instead of including it in salaries and benefits. We are showing retiree health as the yellow slice here at 5%. And you may recall at your meeting, at the last meeting, we talked about this issue. We're spending $4 million a year on the retiree health benefit, and that's a growing cost in the general fund budget. And so we feel it important to highlight that to you because it is an obligation of the city. And so we've added this slice to the pie. Next slide. You've seen this chart before. Just to highlight it, it's basically comparing our revenues with our expenses. And as you can see, when we talked about that forecast with all the numbers on the slide, our revenues are not keeping pace with our expenditures, the biggest pieces of that being our health care and pension costs. And so the council and we all need to be working very hard on how we deal with that issue. And so we've set some goals for economic health, and it's the next slide. It may not be popular, but the city has a lot of approved developments that have already been approved. They just have been waiting for the economy to turn around. Tonight you had yet another final map on your agenda for approval on consent calendar. That is the last approval or entitlement in the process before a developer goes from raw land to starting construction. And I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look around up in the north of Browns Valley and Southtown areas. You're actually starting to see large grading equipment and water trucks out there watering. And so we're starting to see some earth move and people gearing themselves up for new development. And those two areas are part of our community facilities districts, which provide funding for police and fire. Unfortunately, the good news is that it's moving, and I'm expecting to see some growth in building permit activity. The bad part is we won't see the benefit of that into the city's general fund picture probably until 15-16. So while there's good news on the horizon and we're seeing things move, it's not going to mean short-term fixes for our funds. We need to be looking at establishing long-term funding programs to offset unfunded liabilities. As you know, the GASB regulations are going to require us to include those unfunded liabilities on our financial documents, and that unfunded liability is a daunting issue for us to address, and so we need to be looking at that. Want to look at improving our sales tax revenues through the filling of the vacant stores around Vacaville, thus our marketing effort. Thank you very much for your vote of confidence on that tonight. It will really help us to focus our efforts. And then we still need to have more focus on new job growth and high-paying job sectors and aviation, pharmaceuticals, and others. And I'm happy to report that we're seeing significant progress there, and I anticipate probably at least 1,500 new jobs in Vacaville over the next 3 years in those two areas alone. So that's very exciting. That means there'll be people moving to Vacaville, buying houses, getting great jobs, spending their money here. So all of those things are very good.